Hello, innovators. I'm Dustin Miller, PolyInnovator. Today I'm talking with Thomas Hitoshi Pruiksma, the language consultant for Cozy Grammar, poet, polyglot, teacher, tutor, magician, and author. Thank you for joining me on the Polymath Polycast.
My pleasure to be here, Dustin.
And so I like to have the guests say hello to the innovators in the audience.
Hello, innovators.
Hello, and welcome to the Polymath Polycast. We're here to talk about all your different shows that you've done and the various languages you've learned, and just a whole bunch of different topics, which is perfect for this show. The one way I like to start everything off is to have you share something about yourself that no one knows about you.
Something that nobody knows about me.
Yeah.
Well, one thing that comes to mind that nobody yet knows about me is that, every day I begin the day with a kind of meditation practice where I have some sitting practice, and then I actually go for a particular kind of running practice. And I mean, that's not unknown to people, but as part of that practice, I end up with qualities I want to focus on each day. And so nobody knows what the qualities I want to focus on today are except for me. And so the qualities that came to me in my meditation this morning are wholeness and humility. So there's something that nobody knows except until this moment, but me, about how I'm approaching my day. I'm interested in how do the qualities of wholeness and humility inform what I do, inform how I look at things in the world.
And it's interesting too, because a lot of the most successful entrepreneurs and business types, they always talk about starting the day with something controlled, your morning routine, so to speak, whether that is meditation and or exercise. You're doing both, which is great. You mentioned running there, and so I think that probably gets into a runner's high, which gets you into that alpha state still too. So it's interesting.
Well, for me, as a writer, I spend a lot of time seated. But for me, writing is not a sedentary activity. Writing grows out of the whole. There's that idea again, the whole of my life experience, both the kind of stillness that we find in a meditative state and also the activity that we can get when we're running. And, even when I'm running, I'm hoping to be still, if that makes any sense, still within myself, even as when I'm sitting in a kind of meditative state or I'm writing a book, which is much the same state. There's a lot of activity. There's a lot of movement within me, and movement of thoughts, movement of feelings. So those are two poles of something that I don't see as being opposed to each other, but rather being complementary to each other.
It's almost like even though you're exercising in a way, it's almost like a recovery phase since you're moving so much when writing. It's almost like the opposite. You're physically moving, but your mind can relax.
Yes, that's true. That's very true.
That's interesting. And so you got all this going on. You have your daily mantra, not mantras, but so to speak, but your meditation and just overall lifestyle. Then on top of that, with all the poems, and you're doing online content now with Cozy Grammar and these interviews, all this going on. But what got you started before that? What was your mindset?
What got me started before that with what I'm doing or with my...
It's a pretty generalized question there. I didn't mean anything specifically per se. So just in general, what got you started and through your journey, I guess? That's probably good way to...
Well, I think what got me started at the beginning, if we want to go back to the beginning, is a kind of sense of wonder, both a sense of delight in the world and in our worldly experience, and also a wondering how things work. So I was a kid magician, and part of that came from the delight, the wonder, if you will, of seeing a magician perform at our preschool. And he did some things I think it was the first time I ever saw a magician, and he made some scarves appear and disappear, and he did things with water and maybe with some rings and so on. And so there was that side of wonder, but there was also the wondering, how in the world did he do that?
Yeah.
And so I went home, I promptly raided my mother's sewing drawer, and I found some pieces of fabric that looked kind of like the silk handkerchiefs that this magician used, and I started to make up my own versions of his magic tricks, and that's how my interest in magic began. But I think that those two poles, the wonder and the wondering, have been there all along. Whether it's been in my study and interest in music, or in language, or in philosophy, or in any of these other things. That is probably the seed from which things have grown.
It's interesting too, and that's always the intention behind that question, is to see what that seed would be, what brought you to grow into the person you are today, and that's why I like asking that like pre-questions question, so to speak. So
Yeah,
thank
it's a
you.
great question.
Diving into the main questions here, you speak and translate many languages, and so let's start with how you might have acquired them over the years.
Well, through college, I had studied, I studied Japanese in middle school and high school, but in a class. And so I didn't really learn it very well. My mother's family comes originally from Okinawa, and my grandparents who lived on Maui, my great grandfather had moved from Okinawa to Maui. They spoke Japanese, or kind of Okinawan language, amongst themselves, but not with my mother and not with my sister or myself. And so I had studied Japanese in high school and middle school, but we didn't get to see them enough, and we didn't, learning language in a classroom is not necessarily the best way to learn a language.
Yeah.
And when I was in college, I became quite interested in questions of philosophy. So I really honed in on questions of philosophy, questions of ethics, and also of environmental ethics, so ecology and ethics. But as I was completing my studies, I felt like, I'd left out a piece, an important piece, which was to learn another language. And part of my interest there was not simply to be able to talk to other people, although that was, a very key part of it, but was also interested in how learning another language is also learning another way of thinking and feeling and perceiving the world. That different languages offer different sets of understandings about the world. There are thoughts that are possible in one language which are not possible in the same way in another language. There are certain experiences for which there are words in one language that there aren't in another language. And so I thought, well, I'll go to southern Mexico, and I'll learn Spanish, because I had a friend and mentor in Oaxaca, Mexico, in the city of Oaxaca, in the state of Oaxaca. I was interested in, and continue to be interested in, the indigenous communities in the state of Oaxaca. I thought Spanish would be useful because we have a lot of Spanish speakers also in the United States and North America. I was in the running for a fellowship. I was all set. This was my life. I was going to learn Spanish, go to Mexico, and study, live with some of these communities. And then everything fell apart. The fellowship didn't happen, and I thought my life was over. Interestingly enough, my life was just beginning as far as this phase of my life, because from the time I was a kid, from the time I was, I think 6, 7, 8, and reading the magic books from the library and seeing the kind of drawings that would sometimes populate these books of, not just the European magicians, but magicians from China or magicians from India. For whatever reason, I had this interest in India all along. So in 7th grade world geography class, any time that we had to do a report on a country, I always chose India. And so when this chance to go to Mexico seemed to disappear, another opportunity to go to South India for 2 years appeared, and it would have me learning a very different language, the Tamil language. But it would still allow me to explore a language, and a language in this case quite different from English, and also to explore rooted village communities. And so I did go, and I was teaching at a college as part of the fellowship. But then most of my time I spent learning Tamil, and then finding and living in a village that I remain connected to this day. And so that entry into the Tamil language was my first big entry into learning another language, and it was quite a big one, because Tamil is a very different language from English, and also an extraordinarily rich language. It's the other classical language of India. People usually think of, classical languages in India, we have Sanskrit, and Sanskrit, of course, is very old and venerable, but Tamil is just about as old and has its own long tradition, 2,000 and more than 2,000 years of unbroken literary tradition, and its own thinking about language, its own books of grammar. And for the Tamil grammarians, grammar wasn't just sort of rules of syntax and morphology and the construction of sentences. It was also about the grammar of life, the grammar of how different people in different circumstances tend to behave. And so my entry into what can happen when you learn another language began there.
That's interesting too. And I grew up with a fascination with India as well, so I resonate with you on that. But a lot of mine kind of is mainly through Bollywood movies, which the primary language for many of those are Hindi. I have heard some Tamil in it, but not very much. But from what I heard from your stuff online too, it seems really interesting, and just the various amounts of dialects over there, let alone those two big ones, and Tamil being even huge as well. Yeah, it's interesting there.
Yeah.
One thing I was going to mention too is my father is Mexican, and so he's from Veracruz. And so when you're mentioning Oaxaca, I was like, oh, that's cool. I didn't realize he had spent time there. And then on top of that too, just spending time in Maui and all these different locations, I think exposes you to all those different cultures as well. And I think it's fascinating. You mentioned too, each language has their own words. There's words in German, for example, that are not in any other language, and it's just the way they think in that language versus Tamil or Greek or anything else. It's just fascinating.
Totally. Yeah, very, very interesting.
What languages do you speak?
So I speak comfortably English, Tamil, and Spanish. I did for a time try to learn ancient Greek, and I tried to do it the old school way. I memorized the first 100 lines of the Iliad, and I was sort of going from there into the language. And then, after about a year of this, I had a kind of personal reckoning where I thought, if I really want to do justice to my study of Tamil and of Spanish and of English, because as a poet, I'm constantly trying to go even more deeply into English, I thought, 3 languages is probably about a good number for me and my time, my set of interests, my capacity. So I've chosen to focus on those 3 languages, although I did pick up a smattering of ancient Greek, and it still helps me when I look at, say, when I look up words in the Oxford English Dictionary, they often will give the Greek in the Greek letters. And I remember enough to be able to sort of piece together those words through the Greek letters. So those are the main 3 languages.
Well, and that's interesting too, because you might only do those 3 now, but you still have decades in your life that you could probably learn another one.
This is true. I mean, there's languages I would love to learn. And who knows, maybe I will learn. So perhaps the better answer is to say, well, those are the 3 languages I'm focusing on at the moment.
Yeah, right now. And that's kind of a topic we're going to get on later too, is focus. But it's also interesting too, because you mentioned how you were trying to learn it through just kind of a brute force method, just remembering the words and the way the words are spoken from the Iliad. And I speak about sometimes about the way of learning Spanish for me. I grew up with Spanish speakers, and so I had that immersion, not as much as I probably should have because I didn't practice as much, but I had it there. And I knew more than my peers because of that. But I also took 4 years of Spanish in high school. And then on top of that, Duolingo, which is the app for language learning. And surprisingly, that comes a close second to immersion in a way. So I've learned other languages with it too, including Esperanto. Which is a universal language, and there's also Tokipana, which I haven't touched much, but my friend of mine had mentioned it to me. Those universal languages are fascinating as well.
Oh yeah.
What is your experience with maybe Esperanto or some kind of constructed language?
I don't have much personal experience with that kind of language. I mean, as an English speaker, I am interested in how English has become a kind of lingua franca. A language that, we use to speak with people when we don't share a common language. So for instance, in India, a lot of people in different states in India or who speak different languages in India may find themselves speaking to each other in English, even though English isn't their first language. And so it is an interesting situation for someone who grows up with English to have that. It gives a certain, the best word is probably a privilege. It allows you to connect with a lot of people in many different places. But I'm equally interested in languages that are rooted in languages that are very particular to their places, because that's where the poetic richness of a language often lies. So for instance, even with Spanish, which of course is another world language, I have a particular fondness for Mexican Spanish and for some of the indigenous words that have, and indigenous sensibilities, I should add, that have entered into Mexican Spanish. And of course, this is not just Mexico, but I think almost throughout, Central and South America, you have the indigenous influence upon those and within those languages. And same thing with Tamil, which is, on the one hand, quite a grand language with a wonderful and extraordinarily rich tradition. But you also have all these little spoken Tamils. Tamil is a language which has very distinct written and spoken forms. So there's a kind of more standard or literary Tamil, but then the vernacular as it's spoken to this day can vary, you know, over a distance of 10 kilometers or 15 kilometers. So in the village where I lived outside of the city of Madurai, I came to hear certain turns of phrase and also certain voice inflections there that I didn't hear and experience when I went to visit my friend in a village to the northeast of Madurai, maybe just an hour's bus ride. There, in that village, I mean, it was still Tamil, but it had its own flavor. It had its own distinct lilt, its own inflections, and in some cases, its own vocabulary. And I'm, as a poet, particularly fascinated by those particularities, along with the more grand expanse or encompassing nature of languages.
Well, and it'd be really interesting too if you were to find a way through poems to combine a lot of those little niche Tamil pockets, so to speak.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, I think that one of the things a poet does is find a way to take his or her or their own individual particular experience and speak about it in such a way that it does become universal. It does speak to people not only halfway around the world, but maybe 1,000 years apart in time. I think that's why some of the, you know, the great ancient Tamil poets or Greek poets still speak to us, because even though they're speaking out of their own particular language, their own particular experience, they're speaking in such a way that it connects, that it can resonate with us across time and space, which I think is a marvel and a wonder.
The why within. And it's interesting too because of the anthropology of India is so deep and vast that there's so many civilizations that they're still learning about today that we didn't know about. There's that whole little like bridge that was man-made down to one of the islands south of India. It's just, they made like that like thousands of years ago. It's crazy. And what do you see as commonalities between languages then?
It probably depends on which languages. I mean, there are languages that share commonalities. So, for instance, many of the languages in India share common vocabulary, either words that they share from maybe Sanskrit or loan words from Hindi. But there's also sensibilities that families of languages and groups of languages can share. At a wider level, and I think this is something that is particularly important to poets and to poetry. You know, almost all, but not all, but almost all languages have a deep interest, if you can call it that, in sound, and the sounds that we make with our breath, with our bodies. And, you know, poets will be particularly attuned to the sounds of a language, and that will often be their way to bridge between one language and another, is through their sensitivity to sounds and how sounds are produced. Now, of course, as I say that, the exceptions will certainly spring to mind. So, for instance, you think about the different forms of sign language, which, of course, is, you know, it doesn't seem to have anything to do with sound at all. But it does have to do with the body in a different way. And it has to do with these bodily expression of our inner states and our inner thoughts, our inner feelings. There was a wonderful book by Oliver Sacks in which he talks about going to a place, I think it was on Martha's Vineyard, or an island like that, where there was a sizable community where of deaf people who they would sign to each other, and then there were people who interacted with them who were not deaf, but they did also sort of through the course of their daily life learn sign language so they can interact with their friends and neighbors. And he observed a woman sitting, and she was speaking about her experience, and she was thinking back to something, and she suddenly started to think with her hands. Oh. Just like we might be thinking, you know, we tend to think, those of us who are verbally oriented will think in words. We sort of talk to ourselves, so to speak. Well, she was talking to herself, but with her hands. And I thought that was such a fascinating observation about how thought and experience and memory can inhabit our bodies. So, you know, just speaking this answer out, it occurs to me to say that I think different languages have in common, how do we express our inner experience, our inner states, our feelings, our emotions, our thoughts, our observations through our bodies, whether it's through sound produced by the voice, or whether through other forms, movement of the body, sign language, other forms like dance or music.
Well, in sound or movement, it's still just expressions coming out of our senses, touch or voice. And
Yeah.
it comes down to the way we think. The psychologists always say about how when you're learning a different language and you know it well enough to the point where you're basically native in it, you start to think in that language.
Oh,
and
yeah.
So you start to dream in that language as well.
Yeah.
It's crazy how that happens.
It's very, very interesting. I remember when I was going to learn Tamil, which was my first sort of major second language.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember being very excited about one day I'll think in this language or dream in this language. And then when it actually happened, it didn't seem quite as grand as I thought it would, because it's like, oh yeah, but I interact in this language. So of course I would also dream in this language or think in this language.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, it was an extraordinary experience, because when I got to the point, I wasn't sort of translating from English to Tamil and then speaking in Tamil and translating back into English, which the person who taught me Tamil, a wonderful teacher and scholar named Dr. K.V. Ramakodi, he sort of, as early as possible, put an end to that. He said, you must think in the language. You must feel and experience the sounds of the language from within, not through any mediary. So it was a great delight to be able to, I just had a dream in Tamil. Or sometimes I have crazy dreams where somebody's speaking Tamil and somebody's speaking Spanish and I'm somewhere in between. And those are quite a wild adventure, that's for sure.
Well, and it's interesting too, because like when you are dreaming in that language, you just don't think about it because you're speaking a language, which is it's just a communication form. So it doesn't matter. It's usually the reason why people think it's such a grand thing is because you're still learning it. But once you speak it natively, it's not really that grand. I don't speak Italian or French very well, more than a few different words, but I was at a karaoke one night and I go outside and there's 3 guys in front of me and they're all kind of like bantering with each other in different languages. And I'm like, I just kind of joined right into it because I love dabbling in different languages. And when we start bantering to each other, we're pretty young, so we were being kids basically and just kind of cursing at each other in different languages. But it was really funny because it was just a way to just make us all laugh and just kind of have fun with it. But one person would yell at someone in Spanish, the other person would be in French, the other person would be Italian, the other person would be English, and we were going back and forth between multiple different languages. It was just an interesting experience.
Interesting. Yeah.
So you're currently completing a translation of Juan Ruflo's Pedro Paramo. How's that going?
Well, I'm actually completing 2 big translation projects. And one is a 5th century book of poetry and wisdom. Well, 5th or 4th or 3rd or earlier, depending on which sort of scholarly method you're using to date the text. But this is a Tamil book of poetry and wisdom called the Tirukural, or more simply in English, we could call it the Kural, Kural. And that is sort of very much on my mind because it was just picked up by a wonderful press, Beacon Press in Boston. And so they're going to be releasing that book probably October or November of 2021, next fall. So that now that project has come to a kind of completion, I'm now turning my mind again to Juan Rulfo's masterpiece of a novel, Pedro Paramo, which is a book I've been working on now for 15 years. And it's a book I didn't intend to translate. And in fact, these 2 translation projects are more deeply intertwined than they may first appear, which is because in 2003 and 2004, I went back to India. I lived in India from 98 to 2000, to the end of 2000. Then I was back in the States, and then I was back in India for 6 months, and then I was back in the States. But I went back for a year, sort of basically the academic year, 2003 to 2004, on a Fulbright fellowship. And I was pursuing a research project in the Tamil language and in Tamil literature. However, the summer before that, I had given myself, so to speak, the opportunity to go to Mexico and begin that exploration of Spanish that I hadn't had a chance to do before. And I had studied Spanish, and I'd studied it in a very different way than we normally learn languages, which I could talk about a little bit later. But one of the writers that I became aware of was Juan Rulfo. And everywhere I went in the bookshops, I would see this novel, Pedro Paramo. I knew nothing about it. But since I knew the name Rulfo, I picked it up along with 5 or 6 other books that I took with me to India, where I was actually living in the house of Dr. K.V. Ramakodi, my Tamil teacher. And so I wanted to keep my connection with Spanish alive. So every day before breakfast, I would go upstairs. Sometimes I'd go up onto the flat roof and I'd sit there and I'd read Spanish out loud for an hour, just to keep it in the body, to keep learning new words. And then I'd come back down and I'd sort of return to Tamil and spend the rest of the day in Tamil. One of these books was, like I say, Pedro Paramo, and I just fell in love with the book. And I read it 5 times in a row, which I almost never do.
Yeah.
And I came back to the United States thinking, I got to share this wonderful book. There surely has to be a good translation of it. I went to the library and I picked out the translation that was in the library, and I started to read it. And I thought, this isn't the book I read. This is dead. This doesn't have any of the life or life force or poetry of what I read in South India. Oh, well, I'm not going to translate this book, I thought to myself, until about a year later, maybe half a year later. I was at my writing desk working on something completely unrelated, and I suddenly thought, well, you know, if I were to translate the first sentence of this book, maybe I would do it this way. And I started to scribble on a piece of paper different ways of capturing this very famous and powerful first sentence of the book. And then when I got something that I was more or less happy with, I thought, well, but one of the things I love about this book is how each sentence sort of follows the next with this almost inexorable compulsion or urgency. You're sort of pulled along sentence by sentence. So I thought the second sentence has to have the same force as the first. So I started working on the second sentence, and well, now that was all over. I was hooked, and I went back to Mexico, and I lived in Mexico because I wanted to be in, hearing Mexican Spanish and be able to ask my friends, I don't understand this particular Mexican idiom. Can you explicate this for me? So that was 2005 that and I've been working on it ever since. And part of that work has been to become enough of a poet to render the prose of Juan Rulfo, which is extraordinarily potent, because it's really a kind of poetry, even though it's written as it looks like prose. It has a rhythmic integrity to it, even a musical and sonic integrity to it. The whole book has a kind of musical architecture to it, if you will, that is part of its power. And I think part of what the previous translation failed to convey, maybe because the translator wasn't a poet and wasn't a musician. But part of the struggle has also been, now I have a translation that I'm fairly happy with, but the first English translation, which was published, I think, 1959 by Grove Press, at that time, Grove Press got exclusive rights to the translation, and they continue to have exclusive rights, and they have a translation in print by a fairly well-known translator. A lot of people who know the original don't think very much of this translation, myself, of course, included. But because it's already in print and it's selling, to this point, they haven't been interested in looking at a new translation. And legally, I can't actually publish my translation in English with any other publisher. So I'm in this kind of limbo period, and yet I love the book. Yeah. And people have been finding me through my website primarily, and I've been sharing the book in a very sort of non-public way, or it's just a kind of scholarly way. So there was a book group, for instance, earlier during the pandemic. They had started this sort of online book club, and it was very lovely. They asked if they might read the translation, and I gave them the translation. And then I actually got to sit with them during their book club, and we had a lovely 2-hour conversation about the book. And that was very rewarding. Recently, in fact, there was an editor from China contacted me, and she was editing a Chinese translation of Pedro Paramo, and she had found this about my version, and so she wanted to look at it as she was going through the Chinese translation as a kind of, and she also knows English clearly, in addition to Spanish, and so she was using that to compare her reading with this translation. And we also had a lovely conversation about the language and about the language of the book. Yeah. So I, because of those recent experiences, I'm coming back to the work on the translation. I want to read through it one last time. Well, it probably won't be one last time. I'll probably be reading this book till the end. But I want to read it again, and I want to read my translation again and see, is it still ringing true to me? So that when the opportunity does come to publish it, which I trust it will, I'll be ready, and it'll be ready.
And I wonder what you might be able to do to expedite that or something like that. I'm sure you've
That's a
tried
great
many different,
question.
yeah, I'm sure you've tried a lot of different things, but kind of pivoting a bit too, you combine poetry, story, and magic and song all into your performances and talks. How do you go and do that? And what are some of the ways you like to make things flow best?
That's a great question. It began for me out of a strange kind of necessity, which is that after I returned from India for the first time, I discovered that learning Tamil had awakened my senses to English in a way they hadn't been awakened before. I could hear English in a new way, and I could hear poetry in a new way. And I also had realized something I should have realized long before that, which was that I wanted to devote much of my life to writing, to reading and writing. And so I began a kind of somewhat austere practice of I moved to an island and I was living on a farm and I was working in the afternoons on the farm, and each morning I was working on writing and I was learning poetry by heart, and I was keeping up my Tamil. But I also needed some way to make ends meet. And so part of it came from working on this farm, and part of it came from resurrecting my childhood career as a magician. But I found that doing shows like the shows I'd done when I was 10 or 11 or 12 years old, I mean, the magic was still magical.
Mm-hmm.
But part of the charm of being a kid magician was that I was a kid. Like, oh, look at what this kid can do with, a dollar bill. Whereas as a young adult, I was like, well, if I really wanted to do this, I would have to sort of develop a persona, a performing personality of some kind. And that didn't seem like my life path until a poet friend of mine who was teaching in a elementary school in Seattle invited me to do something for her class. And because she had it was a group of fifth graders, and one of them was a budding magician. Mm. And she remembered that I was, doing this side gig of doing magic. And I suddenly thought, well, what if I brought this poetry and language piece and this magic piece together? And so I formed something I called the Poet's Magic. And at first I was sort of taking poems and weaving them in with magic tricks. And then I started writing my own poetry or poetic presentations and weaving them together with effects I started to invent on my own. And that took me a certain distance. But then I thought, and this is partly because of the encouragement of my then partner, now husband, David Milkey, that, I have other experiences that I could weave in here too. Mm-hmm. And those two pieces were, one was a kind of storytelling piece, so that it's not just like, oh, I'll show you a trick now that has some poetry in it, but how can I use poetry? How could I use sort of magical or theatrical effects to tell a story? And how can I bring in my background as a musician? And so in 2018, I did a show for the Vashon Center for the Arts, which told the story of Sadako and the Thousand Paper Cranes. Yeah. And so there it was my first sort of bringing together of not only magic and poetry, but also I wrote some songs for that show. And it was telling this story, which was both the story of Sadako, who was born in Hiroshima, Japan, and she was 2 years old when the bomb hit, when the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. And when she was 12, she gets leukemia. And so there's a famous children's novel called Sadako and the Thousand Paper Cranes that was written about her experience. And this book touched me deeply as a child. So the show is both the story of Sadako and also the story of me as a young kid going to the library, reading this book about this girl in Japan who learns to fold origami cranes with the idea that if you fold 1,000 origami cranes, you get a wish. And her wish, of course, was to be healed of this leukemia. Anyway, so it made sense to start bringing more and more of these pieces together. And then in the most recent show that I've been working on, and this time directly with my husband, David, we've been bringing all of those pieces together into a collaboration where it's me and him together doing a show that we call the Driftwood Bridge, an offering of story and song. And even there in the subtitle, you can see those pieces, song and story, are very much part of it. And then we weave in some magic and some more theatrical kinds of effects, all of which is really just in service of how to share some kind of experience, or how to share some kind of observation or thought, or even a kind of teaching, if you will, or a kind of sharing of insight. And I think that one of the things that a person, especially a person who likes to explore many different areas of life and of learning, discovers is that the more we're able to weave these things together, to integrate them, the more not only we have to offer, but in a strange way, the more we become ourselves, the more we become who we actually are in our own unrepeatable, unique experience, in which all of these different strands interconnect and weave together.
Well, when you discover those things too, you have to experiment to really discover them as well.
Oh, yeah.
And Sadako, that book you mentioned, I had read in school, and so I had not even thought about it until I saw your play on that and your performance. I was like, oh man, that brings me back. I don't remember how old I was when I read it, but I remember reading it, and then I saw the whole aspect of combining those areas together as well. So good on you, Thomas, for making me feel nostalgic as well.
Oh, wonderful.
Another actually interesting experience actually from karaoke at one point, because I went to karaoke and did stand-up comedy as well. And then when I did that,
that takes guts, I have to say.
I was stupid. I should have prepared more. It's fine. Point being is, like, I tried it and I'm wanting to try it again in the future. But it was a fun experience to be able to make people laugh, and then sing is what I really enjoy too. And I dressed up with like a vest and a tie, and it made me look almost like a magician. People kept referring to me as a magician. So someone told me when we were at an intermission, like, you should just combine all three, do magic, comedy, and singing. And so when I saw your stuff too, I was like, man, that makes me think it's just what that person said. It's like, it's a great combination. So yeah, you and your husband both wrote, composed, and performed together in a show, and it takes that skill for you both to bring together such various skills into one piece. How did you go about it then?
Well, the seed idea for it, it went through various iterations, and I'll see if I can summarize briefly. But there was a show that David had wanted to create. He wanted to create something he called a gay-beret, which would be a kind of cabaret, in which he would sing songs that were traditionally sung by women, so like musical theater songs, and just see what happens if you have a man singing it instead of a woman. But that soon evolved into him writing his own songs about his own experience, and he would write the words and the lyrics, and I would arrange them for the piano. I play the piano. And so I would compose a kind of accompaniment. And that started to evolve away from being a kind of cabaret into being more of an autobiographical kind of show, or a memoir on stage, if you will. So that was in the works. And then due to a series of different circumstances, we'd also been thinking, after marriage became legal, we thought, well, should we get married? Should we not get married? There's a place on the island where we live, an art center it's an old, it's actually an old warehouse that used to store big bags of coffee for a major coffee distributor. And I'm affiliated. We both performed at this space. And it occurred to us, if we got married on the island, maybe we get married there. And one day we suddenly thought, well, what if we did the show and we got married? And suddenly it's like, okay, there you go. We have no more debate. We'll just do that, because that's what you do, right? You write an original musical for your wedding. Yeah. But it was a way, in fact, to work on this show that had already been in development. And then so it became sort of our first workshop production, and people really responded to it. And so then we expanded it into a 2-act version, and we performed that last year. And then we were supposed to, in fact, this month and next month, be performing it at a theater in Seattle. Of course, there's no live theater right now, thanks to the pandemic. So we've had to postpone that at least till the fall of 2021. And we'll have to play it by ear. Although at the same time, we thought, well, we don't want to sort of hold this show back. So we've started streaming it online on its own website, driftwoodbridge.com. The show is called The Driftwood Bridge. But what this experience has been teaching us is, to write and compose and perform and to create the set and all of these pieces, we've had to draw on all of our experience. And not only that, there's also the additional piece of how do we, manage the sort of business side of putting on a piece of theater. The advertising and the marketing, all things which are, not my usual kind of experience. But I think if a person is committed to doing good work, and if they discover, oh, well, I really should know something about social media marketing, or I really should know something about how one organizes a budget for a theatrical production, well, then you learn, right? And you learn how to bring those additional strands into the whole, so that the whole experience is a satisfying experience, not only for the audience, but also for you as a person and as an artist. So we've been learning a ton about all of those things. I mean, now we're learning a ton about streaming a show online and connecting with people and getting online reviews and so on and so forth. So it's really been a great arena for exploration and growth, and a very practical, very, very much. Catalyst is a wonderful word for it.
Thomas, that's interesting too. And many points to kind of go off of there. I love marketing, omnichannel, and social media. So you can ask me questions if you want afterwards or something like that. I was thinking too, considering your personality and the theatrics that you end up kind of employing, TikTok might be a good platform for you.
I've been hearing a lot about TikTok. I'll have to check it out.
Make like little clips of your performances, or maybe a introduction to you, and just kind of a way to share those videos that way too. Because I think the younger generations would enjoy it. And you're speaking of weddings as well, and it's just like, I've looked at weddings from all different cultures, whether it's Desi, Christianic, or just all over the place. And Japan's weddings culture is really interesting as well. And I always thought about, what is the best way to make an interesting wedding? Oh, Nordic and pagan weddings are super interesting too. It's just, it's insane how vastly different many of them are, but then the extreme similarities between them too. And having a performance like yours, I think, is a great way of going about it, because you're like, okay, we're doing something for this day. You know what I mean? Yeah. So it's a very interesting concept of like, what can we do to make our wedding unique? And
we had part of our thought was that, so people who knew David better than me, or people who knew me better than David, would want to know more about each other. And so in some ways, the show, that particular version of the show, was a way of telling our stories, so that by the time we did get married on the stage, people knew who was getting married, a little bit more at least, about who was getting married. And of course, as the show has evolved into a freestanding piece, it has, the pieces have sort of rearranged and evolved. But that was very much our intention, and our intention was to as a kind of offering to our guests, and as a kind of gift, if you will. And it made for a very soulful occasion, a very memorable occasion.
Well, and if you look at like Christianic weddings, someone walks down the aisle, great. We do a couple vows like for a few minutes, and that's it. That's the only story you basically get. Maybe the best man speech later on, but other than that, there's not much of a umph to it, and it's just not much of a story behind it. People don't know, especially if you don't know the person who has the wedding. Yeah. So you're certainly a multidisciplinary creative, as we've already kind of delved into there. How has all these areas come together in your life beyond just that performance you guys both did?
Well, it's a continual process. I'm still very much in that continual process. Right. But I was thinking about this the other day, and at one level, it all circles around words. At one level, and particularly the experience of wonder and words, the way our words can evoke wonder or express wonder. And that takes me not just into the realm of books and writing, but into the realm of song, singing, that poetry, the poetic qualities of language. But that also ventures into sort of more philosophical explorations, or to my work as a teacher, for instance, or even into, the apparently, mundane world of grammar, which actually turned out to be not mundane at all, but quite interesting if you look at it from a certain point of view. And so for me, the sort of hub of the wheel is words, but words as an expression of as a way of connecting between our inner and outer experience. I'll put it that way. And so both the sort of solitary experience of reading a book in silence, writing a book in silence, and the more communal experience of a performance, which also has to do with words, where you have people gathered, hopefully this will happen one day again soon, in an auditorium together, or even if the people are connected virtually, there's a shared communal experience of words or of sound in the case of music. So that's been kind of the hub of the wheel. But the continuing exploration of the sort of day-to-day practice of being a creative is to continually ask myself, how do these pieces all fit together? And what new possibilities arise from bringing these pieces together? and to being as inclusive as possible. And that's really been, a practice. I don't think we live in a very inclusive oriented society. I mean, you look at the structure of our schools, or you go to a college, very soon you have to choose a major, and you have to, you focus in on some department or some sub-department of a larger department. And so the unspoken teaching of the organization of our universities and colleges is that knowledge is divided.
Yeah, or
divided into different boxes, and you peg yourself into one.
Yeah.
Whereas my experience as a creative is, yes, there's something to be learned by going deeply into a subject, but that learning becomes all the more amplified and interesting when you return to the question, well, how does that relate to this? Mm-hmm. How does poetry relate to physics, or whatever the case may be? And the most interesting writers and the most interesting creatives to me are those who have dared to find some way to integrate the different strands or the different pieces of their experience, because that's how we get new vision. Mm-hmm. That's how we get new vistas and new perspectives on what it means to be a human being. What does it mean to live on the earth and have an embodied experience of life on earth? To put it in, maybe grand terms, but it's grand.
We like to get meta on this show. Yeah, no, and it's interesting. Just even my last guest, Pradeep Sangha, we were talking about the balance of science and philosophy, and that's kind of the connections that you're referring to. And you mentioned too, words have a big power. Our society has conformed us to be specialists. Like you said, you pick one degree in one major, and you have to be funneled into that. The problem is people like you and I, or other people on the show, we have this multidisciplinary inclination. And once we start, that spark happens. We see that there's connections happening here. That curiosity drives us to push us even farther forward. Yeah. One of the things I'm working on is this polymath spectrum, where the different terms people use for multidisciplinary people. So such jack of all trades, or generalist, polymath, multi-potentialites, and just T-shaped even for like business terms. And these different terms come together in a way, different competencies, different knowledge areas, and what have you. But understanding that jack of all trades is not a bad thing. People say, oh, master of none. But the actual full saying, if you look into it, is jack of all trades, master of none, but also sometimes better than a master of one. And that's because you can pull from different areas.
Yeah. There's a wonderful study by the psychologist Ashish Nandi in India. And he studied creativity among scientists. Mm-hmm. And he discovered that you found at a first tier, truly creative scientist, mm-hmm. May be totally ignorant of areas they're supposed to know about, but are exploring anything that genuinely catches their attention. And by making connections to those different areas, they produce original, groundbreaking research. Whereas a kind of second-tier scientist has learned everything they're supposed to learn, all the things prescribed in the curriculum. And they may be very competent and knowledgeable, but they're not the ones making the discoveries, because they're not exploring something that's new. And that newness comes from daring to say, okay, well, here's this piece here, and I know there's some connection to this other piece there. I don't know what it is yet, but I'm going to stay around and stick around to find out. There's something magical, if you will, that does happen when we dare to follow our genuine curiosity. Yeah. Especially when that curiosity doesn't fit into anybody else's box, even our own boxes, because of course our own boxes tend to be not our own at all, but boxes we've inherited. Not necessarily a bad thing, but just the categories, or if you will, the language that we have around us and in us to describe what does it mean to learn something, what does it mean to do something, what does it mean to have a job, or whatever it may be. All of those are also languages, right? And if we learn to step back from those languages and say, well, maybe there's another way to think about this, well, then you're on your way to something new.
True. And this actually leads me into my next question then. This is something I ask all my guests, is what is a polymath to you?
That's a great question. I was thinking about it, and I was curious enough to look in my favorite Oxford English Dictionary. Perfect. Which is I keep very close at hand. And of course, poly, many people know, has to do with many-ness or muchness. Mm-hmm. But I was interested in the word math because, we think of math, our first association in English is mathematics, right? Well, I looked into it, and the Greek root of math has to do with having learned. So a polymath is someone who has learned a lot or many different things. And I liked how that put the accent on action, on the action of learning, on the intentional action of learning. And then I thought, well, what does that have to do with mathematics? And then I looked up mathematics, and I saw that that was, someone who has learned. It's learned. I mean, It's more general than our narrower sense of math. And I was also interested in, why is it mathematics? And well, because mathematics was a whole branch. There are many aspects to what the Greeks called mathematics, and what mathematics has been over the years. So stepping back from that etymological exploration, for me, a polymath is someone who not only has learned much, or has learned many different kinds of things, but also someone who is interested in exploring how all of those things connect. It's not sort of learning a bunch of stuff because it's cool to learn a bunch of stuff. I mean, it is cool to learn a bunch of stuff, but that's not the point. The point is a deeper, more interesting exploration of, what does all this stuff mean? Or how does all of this stuff matter? How can those things be brought together to give us a deeper insight into the experience of living, into how the world works? And to me, that is at least the kind of polymath and polymathic exploration that I'm interested in, is a kind of integrative or inclusive exploration.
I love that, Thomas. Thank you. And actually, one of my secret questions, I guess you could say, was I was going to ask you about the etymology of polymath. And I was talking to someone who considers herself a multi-potentialite, and this person's Italian. She was one of my previous interviews, Mir, and we were talking about there's no word in Italian for polymath.
How interesting.
Like there's polymathia, I think, in Spanish or Portuguese, and I think she looked into it a little bit more, but we couldn't find. There's sprezzatura, which is sort of similar, but not quite there. And there's not. And we think, when we think of polymath, either Arab or Italian Renaissance. And it's interesting how there's no word for that there, but there's other words around the cultures and around the world that are similar.
Very interesting.
Yeah. So pivoting a bit, you spent extensive time teaching students of all ages, as well as now you teach as a consultant for Cozy Grammar. So how has that experience been for you, as in both the person in person, now online?
Well, I've taught, like you say, in a lot of different capacities, and I've enjoyed teaching. I've enjoyed teaching. I taught at the Ohio State University. I taught freshman English, or first year English. I taught some creative writing classes there. I had a lot of fun doing crazy things in my classes, unusual things. For instance, in the first year, sort of basically composition class, I had them reading speeches, because I was interested in them learning about rhetoric in the sort of old Greek sense of ways in which we construct an argument. Because you have to do that, of course, in college level writing. So I had them read speeches, including speeches from Shakespeare. And they're like, what? I didn't sign up for, English 101 or whatever to read Shakespeare. And then people started to love it, because I chose the work very carefully, and it was actually quite interesting. But as a teacher, I found particularly satisfying what had been my work for quite a while, maybe the past decade before the last 5 years. Was tutoring, one-on-one tutoring, because there's something deeply satisfying of connecting with one, or maybe a couple, but usually just one particular student, and really getting to know their interests, their particular capacity for learning, their particular curiosity, their particular hang-ups, learning styles, and all of those things, and then to teach very much to that student. There's something, I think, very organic to that kind of teaching. And of course, you find traditions of that. And so for instance, in India, where you would have a kind of a guru figure, or even just a teacher of language, they have a small enough context. They can be very individual and particular with their students.
Right.
The Cozy Grammar bit came about partly because, so my husband created the Cozy Grammar series with a dear friend and mentor of his named Marie Rackham. She was a beloved English teacher, lived in Canada on Vancouver Island, a dear friend to David. And at a certain point, she was diagnosed with cancer. with breast cancer. And David, at that point, was living in Los Angeles working as an actor, but he moved back to his hometown to help take care for her because she didn't, her partner had died and she didn't have kids. And he had, had this long-standing and very deep and loving relationship with her. And he asked her, well, what would you like to do? And she said, I'd like to be where cancer isn't, which he took to mean that she wanted to do something the rest of her life besides just die and go to cancer treatments. And so he said, well, let's how about we produce a television series and you can teach grammar outside of the classroom. And she said yes, and they created 114 episodes of what became the Cozy Grammar series, the grammar course, punctuation course, essay writing course. And then until she, and she lived, 4 years past what the doctors told her she would live. She was engaged with life, engaged with a project. She played the classical piano soundtrack for the entire series with the idea, and she chose all of this music, talking about poly things. She was interested in contrapuntal music, with more than one line. As a way of helping the mind be more primed for learning. In any case, so she created these series and they were on VHS and then they were distributed on DVD, and then we decided to move them online. And when we moved them online, I became involved. We thought, well, let's as we make this for a new generation, let's make some new supplementary videos, which take how do we look at grammatical concepts that Marie teaches in her videos, which are outside, looking for whales in the woods in her beach cottage, very much contextualizing the study of grammar. How do we show the practicality of grammar? And more than that, how do we show that grammar can actually enhance creativity rather than be a kind of stifling influence upon it? So we've been creating videos for every video that Marie teaches a grammatical topic or a punctuation mark. I have a video in which I teach, well, how does this matter to me as a writer? What have I learned about the behavior of commas or semicolons or dashes in my work? How does knowing about nouns or adjectives or gerunds or various kinds of compound sentences, how does that help me as a writer? So it's been a very interesting exploration, because here too we have this combining of worlds. On the one hand, there's my work as a writer. On the other hand, there's been my experience as a teacher and as a tutor. And this is an interesting way for me to bring those together in a kind of almost, if you will, performative setting, because these videos we film outdoors or in interesting locations. We filmed the supplementary videos for the Basic Cozy essay course in London, and part of what I did in those videos was to make the argument, why London, and as a model for making an argumentative essay. And so I talked about various reasons why London is a great place to talk about writing essays in English, being so important to the history of English, for instance, and so on. And so that's been a very interesting adventure. We're just now in pre-production for the revised version of the intermediate grammar course. And so I've started to look through those episodes again, those lessons again, and think about, well, how do we show how these sort of higher level or more advanced grammatical topics are not ends in themselves, but are instead a means by which a person achieves greater clarity about how language actually works, how it works on us, how we can use the forms of expression at our disposal, the architecture of sentences to convey our own experience and our knowledge in increasingly compelling and graceful ways. So that's been part of my adventure there.
I love that. And I love how it transitioned into online, and probably perfectly timed, so considering everything going on too. We were mentioning marketing earlier as well, and one thing that came to mind is educational content always very well received, and perhaps Instagram and TikTok 1-minute clips, IGTV even, you could probably
we post stuff to IGTV all the time now.
I love it. And I just figured that would be perfect.
And it's been interesting is that in some ways, so these courses were first produced 20 years ago or so, but they were very much ahead of their time, because although they were distributed first on VHS and DVD, they were conceived of with a kind of digital world in mind. In fact, they were shot on some of the first digital technology that there was for cameras. So that's where they've stood up over the time. But also, but they combine taking, what we can do online, learning online, but not keeping it confined to, say, a person in front of a blackboard on a YouTube video or something like that. So how do we use video? We don't have to be inside. We can go outside, because even though the video happens to be streaming through a computer or a tablet or whatever. So we're really trying to bring as much sort of out of the box thinking, if you will, to something like teaching grammar. And that's been a lot of fun, and it continues to be a lot of fun as we continue to figure out what is it we're actually doing, and how do we have a presence in the world digitally that builds upon the sort of analog presence beforehand in the best way possible.
I love that, and it bridges the old and the new in a good way. And it actually, you mentioned prior to me about how you want to help spread the word about grammar and punctuation courses that you teach through Cozy Grammar. And so it's interesting how that inspires you so much, and you can see the expressions in your face when you explained it as well.
Yeah, well, I have, partly because of learning other languages, and partly because I am a writer, I do have an excitement about grammar, which people don't tend to get excited about. They tend to think of, all those rules I'm supposed to follow, and I'm probably breaking all the time. And I think that's largely how grammar has been taught. But my interest in grammar is kind of as a toolbox, or even more than a toolbox, as a kind of set of magnifying glasses, if you will, that give us insight into the inner workings of words, into the secrets, if you will, of words. And of course, for our basic courses, we're laying a foundation. But what I'm interested in for the advanced course, the intermediate course, and then the advanced course that we're projecting or planning for, would be how to look at grammar really as a way of enhancing our perceptions, of enlivening our perceptions of language in the service of, and it doesn't mean it's just for people who write, but for anybody who uses language, which is basically all of us, right? Especially, people who are, even if somebody is producing content online and they're speaking, they're not writing, but they're speaking in a video or making it, it's still a kind of language that they're using. And there are ways of learning how the grammar of a written language, the insights into that process can give us insights into the larger creative process of creating any kind of offering, whether it's even just a visual thing, because there's a kind of a visual grammar to design or to painting, if you will. And ultimately, like I say, all of these things really do connect. If we can, any subject in a way can be an entry into everything. If you're daring to look at how does that connect to everything else.
Well, you mentioned like grammar is kind of like the architect of sentences, and it's architecture, I guess you could say, of sentences. And whenever you explain that, especially in design, it made me think of the graphic design aspect and how certain colors need to match in some ways. Like when you're doing videography and you want to have these LUTs or the video colors effects, a lot of people go for the orange and teal because it complements each other and that kind of thing. Those kind of subtle rules, I guess you could say. No matter what kind of medium, whether it's audio, visual, video, or written in this case.
Totally.
Architecture of that creative piece.
Yeah, and that architecture is often invisible unless we train our eyes to recognize it. I mean, we're being shaped by physical spaces all the time. The architect, Frank Lloyd Wright, once famously said that he could design a house that would cause a married couple to divorce in less than a month, because he thought that the spaces that we inhabit can be have that much of an effect on the interactions that happen in those spaces. Similar things happen with language. Our language can encourage or foster inclusivity or kindness or generosity, or our language can foster divisiveness or narrowness, and all of these things. And part of that is the word has to do with the words that we use, and part of it has to do with the structure of our sentences, which is really about the structure of our thoughts, the way we perceive our experiences and our feelings. And so, at a certain level, the study of grammar can be quite profound. Just like the subject of any subject, the study of any subject can be quite profound if you go deeply enough into it.
Well, and you mentioned a few different things there. I'm going to go off of a couple of them. One of which was kind of making me think of the convincing of people, which comes down to like marketing and copywriting. And there's this way to structure it. There's a way of going about it. If you look at Arby's or any Sunday fast food chains, there's a reason why they're red. There's a reason why
Mm,
Facebook and social media are blue. It's because of the
mm.
way that that message subliminally put implants a message in your brain, just like you mentioned the architect could build a house to make this couple divorce because of the way that these messages end up implanting in ourselves that we don't even think about.
Yeah.
And the other thing was the tiny house thing. So you said like living in like a minimal space, and you can see in your place there is that what is it like to dwell within a yurt?
Well, that's a very interesting question. And in fact, I've just finished the first draft of a book about the experience of living in a yurt. So that's forthcoming. Maybe I'll reappear on your Polycast to talk about that next. But one of the things I found so interesting about living in this yurt or ger, as many words actually from Central Asia for this kind of structure, is that it's a round structure. I don't know if you can see very well from
You can
where
actually,
we are,
like from what I've seen,
but it has it's a round structure, and we tried when we set up the space to keep a kind of roundness. So we're in my writing office. Above is the loft where we have our bed, but you look this way, and so everything opens into the center, because we found that the roundness is adds a very interesting feeling to our daily life.
Yeah.
Again, a kind of sense of inclusivity or being held. Of course, along with that goes the fact that, we basically live in one room which has sort of different aspects and different areas that are dedicated at certain times to certain purposes, but then can also be transformed to make it into, so this space out here can be for rehearsing a show, it can be for dancing, it can be for a formal dinner with family, so it can be the living room, the studio, the music studio, an extra bed, extra bedroom, so it's a very versatile space. But of course it also means that if stuff comes up in the relationship, it's right there. You can't sort of run off to some back room and hide. And in fact, part of our reason for living in a space like this was to give us the opportunity to really become skillful at delving into those things and being very honest with each other and learning how to talk through all the kinds of things that inevitably arise in any kind of long-term relationship. So it's been very useful for that, and for being held within, again, it's almost a kind of maternal, if you will, shape or space. I think, especially for those of us growing up in sort of North America or in Western culture, we're so used to kind of a grid pattern, right? This is the Cartesian model of the world, which you have, a room is square or rectangular, ceilings are flat. But that doesn't have to be that case at all. You look at, traditional architecture, even traditional architecture in Europe, domes, arches, rounded spaces, and suddenly it's like this breath of fresh air. Oh, there's a lot more to life than just boxes. Squares are great too. Rectangles are great, but they're great along with all of these other, and I think the more inclusive we are with our understanding of what a building can be, what an education can be, the more enriching our lives become. It's natural and quite inevitable in a certain sense.
Well, and again, so many of the points I can make off of that there, but one of which is that I was literally laying on my bed staring at my ceiling the other day. I was like, I don't like how it's flat. I don't like how it's just boring. There's a little speckles. It's a common occurrence with these cheaper apartments to have little speckles in the ceiling to make it less monotonous, but it's still not very great. And I've seen the Venus Project or GeoShip and these other kind of various houses that they're doing, like they're round, and there's a reason why they're doing that, because it makes it more inclusive. And there's also even Walt Disney had Epcot, and he was trying to make a city, and his whole city was based off a circular structure. And it's interesting how there's various different modalities of creating a living space. And then the other thing I wanted to kind of go off of is this tiny home concept that's been growing a lot. And that's kind of what makes me think of what you're doing there. I've always wanted to live in one because I don't need that much space. Like this background seems a little crazy, but it's very empty in this room most of the time. And so it's just interesting how when you can minimize what you have less materialistic things to overwhelm you and have to worry about.
Yeah. Well, one of the great things about living in a small space is that it fosters an awareness of stuff.
Yeah.
So for instance, as a writer, I do end up collecting books. People give me books, or I get books that I want to read, but I often find myself quite consciously going through, because, books come in. Unless I want the whole space to be filled up with books, some books have to go out. And rather than thinking of that as a kind of, bad thing, I find it's a wonderful thing to periodically go through my library and say, I've loved having this book and I haven't looked at it in 5 years. I could give it to somebody else and it would benefit them more than me. Right?
Exactly.
So that the objects that we do have, or the material possessions we do have, are fully serving us now.
Mhm.
What we're doing now, what we're exploring now. And that leads to a certain kind of clarity in one's own mind
Mhm.
too, because you're not sort of holding on to old stuff that you don't need anymore, that somebody else might make better use of than you might at the moment.
Well, there's a lot of Buddhist concepts that talk about materialistic things and trying to let go
Yeah.
of attachment, as you know. And it's kind of funny that we mentioned books and getting rid of things. I've always been an avid video gamer, and you can even see the controller right there. And my sister started pursuing some of that. She's much younger than me, so I wanted to pass on what I know to her. And I bought this Zelda book where it's like a historia of that world. And it was an expensive book, so I never wanted to get rid of it, but I also never read it. It's been sitting in my closet for nearly a decade, whenever it came out. And I look at it every once in a while. My roommate, I think, even has the same book, so I could just listen. I can go read his if I need to,
Yeah.
or to get it online. So I realized,
Yeah.
okay, let's just give it to her so she can explore
Yeah.
that world more and experience it. And so actually, right before our meeting with you today, I drove over there. In fact, that's why I have this on my hands, because I let my sister paint my nails.
Oh, how lovely.
Because she was like, I want to do it. And I was like, okay, fine.
That's awesome.
I'll do that. But yeah, letting it go with someone else who can enjoy it.
Well, there's something about the idea of circulation,
Mm-hmm.
right? About allowing things to continue their movements. A book comes in, a book goes out. Ideas come in, but if we don't do something with the ideas that come to us, if we don't think about them, transform them, express them, share them with others, then they also become stagnant.
Mm-hmm.
There's something about allowing a kind of flow or a circulation, just as the body needs blood circulating through it to thrive, just as we need air entering and exiting all the time. So too, I think our living spaces, and so too our minds, which are deeply interconnected, need to have a flow in and out. And that when we achieve a kind of balance of what's coming in and going out, for very crude terms, all sorts of things start to happen.
Yeah. Well, and this kind of makes me think of entropy and how the universe works, which we can go on a whole tangent there. But let me ask this then, because it's kind of on that philosophical mindset still. Where does empathy and kindness come into your life?
Well, it comes in everywhere. I mean, or my intention at least is that it might come in everywhere.
Mm.
I love that the root of kindness is the word kind, which isn't just being nice to somebody, but which is also offering or honoring the kind of person or thing or whatever it is we're looking at is. We're looking at the nature of a thing, right? That deeper meaning of the word kind, the kind of thing, the nature of a person. And so my understanding of kindness is to really honor the nature of the people that I'm around and with, the nature of and the nature of the world in which I am. So to be kind to the trees around our yurt is to be fully aware of the nature of the trees and how they interconnect with the forest and with with the air and the whole ecological cycle that is involved with trees and with the ground and with the earth. So for me, kindness is a kind of a root practice, a root stance, if you will. Similarly with you said compassion, right? The other word?
Empathy.
Empathy, the capacity to get out of our own narrow selves, to get out of our own experience, and to be aware of the experience of others. I think this is crucial, for instance, for a writer or for a musician or a composer. How do, in our process of translating, if you will, our thoughts, our experience, our imaginative insight into a form that can be shared with others, how how do I simultaneously allow myself into the experience of others, imagine my way into the experience of others such that I can come to know them in a deeper way, especially to understand difference. Because of course, we live in a time where people from different backgrounds, languages, cultures, religions, political leanings are all sort of thrown together more and more. Sometimes with wonderful results and sometimes with a lot of discord and division. And so empathy, I think, is more crucial than ever in understanding and coming to not just understand, but to know in a kind of experiential, emotionally intelligent way, something of where different people are coming from, so that we can be kind in that deeper, truer sense of being true to our own natures and our own experience and to the natures and experience of other people.
Mm. Well, and I had seen the picture of Driftwood Bridge that made me see those two words there, and that's why I wanted to ask you. So I was curious to see how those words might come into form, especially in your life, and what might come out of your mind when you ask that question. Because I want to be more philosophical in the show when I can, and I thought that'd be a good pathway for that.
Oh, lovely. Well, those words came out of a particular context in the show, which I don't think you can see in that. I'm thinking of this, the photograph you're thinking of, which has to do with that connected to my experience of living in South India and of learning Tamil for the first time, because I had discovered that learning a language, you really become a baby all over again, because you can no longer express yourself in the way that a baby, will cry and will laugh and will smile, but can't sort of give us a philosophical discourse about what they're feeling. Yeah. They struggle to find words. And that's what happens when you immerse yourself in another language, especially one that's very different from your own. And I found myself so utterly dependent on the kindness and empathy of other people to be patient enough with me as I was learning their language, to be able to intuit what I might not yet be able to say that I need, to be deeply hospitable, if you will, to who I happen to be out of my usual context. And so along with the words kindness and empathy, I would also say a kind of deep stance of hospitality has been absolutely central to my own experience, my own life, both as a recipient of such open-hearted hospitality, but also as someone who aspires to practice in my own life and way a kind of deep openness to other people and to their experiences.
And I resonate with that. That's something I feel like I try to do with these guests on the shows, like yourself, where I want to be able to make you feel comfortable and have an open experience too, so you can express yourself in the way that you feel most apt, which most of the time is that multidisciplinary aspect.
Yeah. Well, I think you're doing a marvelous job.
Thank you. And then one thing that keeps grabbing my eye is that poster behind you with the writing in red.
This one here?
Yes. I was going to ask you what that particularly means.
Well, this is, I wish I could, I don't know if I can bring it out. It's sort of, but it's a poem by the poet Hayden Carruth, wonderful poet, not as well known as he really should be, who's a very important poet to me. If I can put it into a shorter version of a much longer story, that same time I was living in South India and reading Spanish in the mornings and studying this Tamil book, which I've now translated. One morning I woke in the morning and I thought, I didn't even think it. It was like the word Hayden, the name Hayden Carruth was hovering in the air in front of me and inside my head at the same time. It was one of these sort of dreamlike experiences, although I had woken up. And I suddenly thought, okay, this is a poet who's going to become important to me. I'd heard his name. I'd read a couple of his books, but I didn't know it very well. I didn't know his work very well. And so when I returned from that trip, I also read everything of Hayden's that I could find, and I wrote to him. I started corresponding with him. I had a chance to visit him twice before he died in 2008, I believe. 2008, 2009, somewhere. I think it was 2008. Anyway, very important poet to me. And the poem on this broadside is one of the very first poems of his that I read. It's from a little book called The Clay Hill Anthology. In the 70s, he was commissioned to do an anthology of American poetry of the 20th century. And so he was reading literally thousands of books. So he wasn't writing very much, but as a poet, he had to write something. So he started to write these little haiku just not in a very elaborate way, but just 7 poems of 5, 7, 5 syllables. That was his sort of self-imposed structure. And so this poem asks, what is the use of poetry? Poetry is what uses us. And I loved that poem when I read it. And then this broadside was created by Sam Hamill, who started Copper Canyon Press and who took over Hayden Carruth's. He became Hayden Carruth's publisher when his other books were not being kept up by his previous publishers. And Sam also became a friend of mine. So this is a sort of testament to Sam, to Hayden Carruth, and to the idea of poetry being what uses us, right, as opposed to it being what we use for some purpose. So a non-instrumental view of poetry, but rather an instrumental view of us, the creator, who becomes an instrument for something larger than himself or herself, themselves.
And I'm glad I indulged that curiosity then, because that was an interesting story. So thank you, Thomas. Can you tell us the secret to do many things well?
Part of what I've discovered to be the secret to doing many things well is to paradoxically do less. Now, that may sound strange. What I mean by that is something very specific, which is that I've discovered that if I can really allow my attention to be fully present to one task, and I can carry out that task in such a way that the task is complete. And then I can turn my attention to another task, whether it's learning something or writing something, creating something. And the more fully I do only one thing at a time, the more fully I end up doing many things well, because all of that depends upon the quality of our attention. My experience, at least, has been that if I try to do many things at once, my attention and my attentiveness is scattered. Mm-hmm. And so things get lost. Whereas I say the same 10 things I wanted to do, and I do them sequentially in an order that makes logical sense. But when I'm doing that one thing, I'm doing that one thing all the way, then those 10 things get done well. Mm-hmm. And even more important than that, I've also deepened my practice of attentiveness. I've become more adept at paying attention or allowing my attention to include something. So in some ways, the way to do more is to do less, if you're interested in doing whatever it is you're doing well. Yeah. And that kind of attention to whatever it is you're doing in that moment then ripples out to everything that you do. And then you suddenly realize, oh, I've done a heck of a lot of things. And I've done them at a high level because I've done each of those things fully. Right. That's been my experience thus far, and is my current sort of working principle, creative principle, if you will, of approaching my daily work.
Well, and it's interesting that you say that, because it's similar to what I've been hearing from other people as well lately, where, for example, in psychology, they say you can't really multitask. This is not possible for our brains. We are one task per people. We just switch between them really quickly. Problem is, when you switch, it still takes 21 minutes to get focused again on that task. On top of that, there's Cal Newport with his book Deep Work, and understanding that spending a few hours of real intentional work, like you were saying there, Thomas, is much more effective. And then on top of that, just one more kind of realizations that if people want to be polymathic, and this is kind of something I was realizing after what you just said, is that in order to be polymathic, it's not about doing a whole bunch of things at once. It's about doing one thing after the other, sequentially, like you're saying, but powerfully. Most people want to stop and relax or maybe go play, but most people like us who want to do more, not only do we get more energy from doing more things, especially sequentially, so we have the confidence of, hey, I did that really well, maybe I can do this really well. Yeah. That's interesting. And so going into the kind of wrapping up of the show here, I wanted to ask, where can people find you online?
Well, probably the easiest way to find me is through my website, thomaspruiksma.com. Pruiksma, KSMA, because that connects to everything else that I do. You can go from there to Cozy Grammar. If you're interested in exploring my work through Cozy Grammar, you can go from there to the Driftwood Bridge, or to driftwoodbridge.com, where the Driftwood Bridge, our show, is currently streaming online. And you can also, on my own website, there are poems of mine, excerpts from my shows and writing and so on. So that's probably the fastest way to, if you're interested in some of the things I've talked about, to explore those further, because that's kind of the hub. Everything else connects to that.
Well, and I'll make sure I have links in the description for you. I have a whole bunch right there. And it's interesting too, because when I was experiencing your site, you have a lot of various things to go into, whether it's poems or videos or Cozy Grammar. And I've experienced something similar where there's a lot of aspects of PolyInnovator. And something I thought about just now, actually, when you were explaining that, is the structure of your site. It's pretty good too, I would say that, because it's hard to organize all the different facets that you're trying to exemplify there. And the architecture of web design, which is similar to what we were talking about earlier, that's real key. And so I've been having issues with mine where I'm not explaining mine very well. So I might need to take a page out of your book there.
Well, I've just been thinking I want to go back and tweak a couple of things, because it's an iterative process. You're always coming back to it. And I think this goes along with what we were talking about earlier, that if we're willing to come back to something with a fresh mind, with what the Zen Buddhists call a beginner's mind. Even if I've looked at my website 1,000 times before, if I look at it as if I'm looking at it for the first time, maybe I'll have a new insight. Oh, well, maybe this piece actually belongs over there, or maybe my menu organization, maybe the categories can be shifted around, or maybe I ask a friend to say, hey, look at this website. What does this tell you? And it may tell them something very different from what it tells me, because I'm me and I know what it's supposed to mean, but they're them when they see what they see. Right. So that's where we can be very helpful to each other in sort of reflecting back to each other, not what we think we've done, but what we've actually done. And that's another part of the process of how do we become more skillful in whatever task we're doing, is to be really, to discover a kind of clarity about what is it we are actually doing, as opposed to what is it we think we're doing, what we thought we've done.
Yeah. Well, in design, that definitely makes a big point too. It's like, if we think we did something well and then someone goes to it and doesn't understand it, then we obviously didn't do it well.
Yeah.
And I really like being able to drag and drop. So what you see, what you get editors where you can actually drag the things you want to put in different places. Those are very useful. But there's an exercise in web design where you get a friend, sit down and have them go through your sites, and you don't say anything. You just simply observe and see how they move and what they do. And that's always interesting.
It can be very illuminating.
Yeah. And then the final thing is, what could be a call to growth for people in the audience?
A call to growth. Well, for me, the art of writing, which is sort of my master art, if you will, the model that I use for all of the other forms of creativity that I explore. The art of writing for me is actually the art of listening. It's the art of listening deeply to what arises from within, especially when one has found a state of calm, or even found a kind of calm in a chaotic situation. Right. And so I would say to anyone who is interested in becoming, as you say, polymathic, or becoming masterful at several disciplines or several areas of life, or even more important, interested in integrating the different parts of one's life, the best thing you could do is to cultivate a deep listening, the capacity to listen. And that means both internally to what arises in oneself, and externally to listen to what people are saying beyond what they might seem to be saying, or to listen to words out loud. I mean, one of the best things for me in learning, discovering poetry, was to read poetry out loud and to listen to it rather than just think my way into it. And so my call would be to listen as deeply as you can.
And what's interesting there too is that even while you were speaking, I'm trying to make sure I active listen. It's something I've still struggled with, even though I try to do it very well each time. It's a skill and you have to practice. And
yes.
I always look at the camera, so I can't look at you when you're speaking, but I can listen. And I would shut off my eyes essentially. I'm looking at the camera obviously, but I would just stop really focusing that way. So I'll defocus and just focus on the hearing and try to hear what you were saying there and try to incorporate that. So thank you.
You're very welcome.
Well, once again, this is Dustin Miller, PolyInnovator, and Hitoshi Pruiksma on the Polymath podcast. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.